My name is Laura Calandrella. I am a consultant to Keeping Forests and really specifically work on the collaborative partnership efforts as well as collaboration strategy. Today, we have some exciting research to share with you how to talk about Southern forests with the public. But for those of you that aren't, well, let's start with what the agenda is today. So we'll start with what is Keeping Forests so that you have a context for the coalition as a whole and what we're about. Then I'll ask Kellen to talk about what was the goal of the research and contextualize it a little bit more within the strategies that Keeping Forests has. Lori will then present the research results, which will be the bulk of our conversation. And then there'll be time for participant Q&A. As Leslie mentioned, please drop those in the Q&A box, not necessarily in the chat, so that we can track that a little bit better. It's difficult for us to make sure that they're all followed when hopefully you guys are engaging one another in the chat as well and having conversation there. So Keeping Forests was formed in 2015 with the goal of protecting, sustaining, conserving 245 million acres of Southern forest land in the South, largely driven by a project called the Southern Forest Futures, which was projecting that there would be a loss of 23 million acres. If you go on our website, keepingforest.org/resources, you will find more information about the problem statement and how we've gotten to where we are, including the full research results that Lori will present today. Keeping Forests is a broad coalition of multi-stakeholder partners. If you think about all of the partners that might be engaged in private, nonprofit, and public entities, we're touching them all in some way. And this group has really done a beautiful job of coming together and learning how to collaborate across bridges and perspectives to get to the place that we are today to present this research. I want to introduce Kellen and Lori. So Kellen is a senior campaign manager for the Nature Conservancy. She is also leading the team within Keeping Forests that focuses on building champions and leaders for Southern forests. So Kellen has a background in environmental policy. She's a lawyer and had worked on financial mechanisms. She uses legal research, strategic planning, and targeted public opinion research to create inclusive, collaborative environments that lead to campaign success. Lori is a Southerner hailing from Arkansas. She now lives in Denver, and she has 30 years of public opinion research as well, with roots in Republican policy, also looking at how to bridge divides across partisan lines that enable winning majorities. And I just want to know, I was looking at her bio, in the 2020 election, 14 ballot measures on which she conducted the research were all victorious, matching her undefeated record on 18 measures in 2018. So we are in excellent hands today with what we do with this research. And with that, I'll turn it over to you, Kellen.
Hi, good morning, everyone. It's been really fun to see where everyone is hailing from in the chat. It's a nice way to do icebreaker, I think. And shout out to Lynn in Huntsville, Alabama. That was my one other Alabamian that I saw, but welcome to everyone else. So yeah, I'm Kellen Garrison. I work for the Nature Conservancy and I run campaigns. What does that mean? I run all kinds of campaigns promoting conservation and all the different issues that goes with that, generally in the public sphere. So that means public education, working with legislative campaigns, certainly on ballot initiatives where we just got a fun shout out from Lori and her success there. And the fun part of all of that is while we often think of campaigning of what we hear on the nightly news with candidate campaigning, the wonderful thing about working on campaigning with forests and conservation more generally is there is support for the type of work we do in every state among every demographic. And it's been a lot of fun to work on this and see the evolution of a real positive lens towards the type of work that you all do and certainly that I'm passionate about, regardless of politics. And we'll see some of that today in our research. So what is the goal of what we're doing at Keeping Forests when it comes to public opinion research? Well, one thing that we noted really early on in this process is that we have a major goal of changing perception of working forests in the South. And that could be from preaching to the choir. That means our own organizations within various state regional, and federal agencies, and then also with corporate partners. So even those of us who love forests for all these wealth of reasons, sometimes we're not using the right language. Sometimes there are misperceptions, and sometimes, quite honestly, we're just like talking to ourselves in a vacuum and anecdotally not using the right words, especially when we pivot to talk to the public. So that was one thing that we came upon. And the second thing we did was, while quite a lot of research has been done in other regions of the US, especially forested regions in the Pacific Northwest and in the Northeast, there was kind of a black hole of public opinion research related to forests in the South. Well, considering Keeping Forests is a coalition of people passionate about protecting forests in the southern United States, we said, we got to fix this. So we embarked on a process most of last year that involved a couple of different things. First, we did a meta-analysis of all the research that's out there that have been done by businesses, by state forest agencies, by Fish and Wildlife, other bigger agencies representing the federal government, and then certainly reaching out to NGO partners to see what they've done. Wasn't a lot, but it was a good baseline of where to start. And then we used a little bit of gap analysis to look at the research that currently existed and said, how can we update this? How can we make it more robust? What are the questions we need to ask? Again, what are the priorities that people are feeling when it comes to forests? We really wanted to identify where there were education gaps, meaning where are there just, again, assumptions that we might have, but they're not really based on any kind of data. And then we started building out a series of questions that we took to a series of focus groups that we did last summer. These focus groups represented people, I believe, from all 14 states, which is what we call the kind of barrier or the boundary line of keeping forests in the southern US. And we started asking them these questions, and not just, posing questions and them responding back to us, but generating conversations among the participants in the focus groups to see what appeals to them, what are they passionate about, what is a no-go for them. Because I'll often say that as much as we want positive information and positive messages about forestry and working forests specifically, at the same time, it's really important for us to know what does not resonate, so that we don't keep perpetuating, misconceptions that really aren't getting us anywhere in terms of creating champions, cultivating champions for forests in the southern US. So then our last part, so that was some nice qualitative information. We had these like dialogues, we had lots of conversation and back and forth between the focus group participants, but we wanted to take it a step further. And that was taking it to a public opinion survey. And again, we were very intentional to make sure that we covered all the way from the Carolinas over to Texas. We all know that just like you hear all politics is local, very often those priorities can be very local too, depending on what the opportunities and challenges are in one's own backyard. So we did a public opinion survey, a poll, making sure that we covered all 14 states, and then really tried to statistically get data for some of these themes that were coming out of the focus groups. Again, the priorities, the threats, the opportunities, and trying to, again, hone in on what are those messages that really resonate, and then what messages don't work. So that's what you're going to hear a little bit about today. And I'm here to help with context. If you have questions, again, use that Q&A box. And if I need to circle back at the end of Lori's presentation, I will. But I think you're really going to enjoy some of the data that we got before, because again, this is the first time we've done this in a systematic way, in a holistic way for southern states. So I'll pass it to you, Lori. Thanks.
Great, thank you. So I think, yep, there we go. I can share my screen now. Perfect. What a lovely explanation of the work that I do every day. I appreciate that. All right, so hopefully you're seeing the first slide. Tell me if not, Kellen. So, okay, cool. All right, so thanks everyone. I jokingly now introduce myself as a member of a maligned profession. Polls have limitations. They are not crystal balls, even though Nate Silver and some of those pundits would like it to be. But what they really are, and this is how I sort of think of it, is as kind of an old-fashioned map, or sort of the first generation of GPS, where you had to input where you were starting. And then figure out, oh, this is the best way to get to where I want to go. And that's essentially what we do with research is we want to know first where we're starting. What are those perceptions? What are the opinions? Where are people starting this conversation? And then what's the most effective way and efficient way to get them where we want them to go? So it doesn't mean that we're trying to ignore or potentially not educate people, but obviously folks are busy. They have a million other things on their plate. They're trying to figure out what to do on the snow day with their kids at home. That's just me in Colorado today. And then they are, they're trying to navigate their own lives. And occasionally they might pop up and hear something about forests. And so when they do, we want to make sure that is something that is going to be compelling and effective. And that's why we test a lot of the information that you're going to see presented today. So Kellen did an excellent job of talking through what we did, but we combined both that qualitative, that open-ended discussion. We did that first. In part because of the pandemic and in part because we wanted representation across all of these states. We did that in an online format, and that can miss a few people occasionally, but we're even doing those when we're talking to respondents. I just did some in rural Wyoming landowners, for example. So we can really reach across different boundaries and into lots of different communities. Better than honestly than we could have if we were doing sort of those traditional in-person focus groups that they make fun of now on TV ads today. And we did that in late August. So we were having that conversation, open-ended conversation. And then we followed that up in late September, very beginning of October, in all the states that you're seeing represented here. 3 states, Florida, Oklahoma, and Texas. We took just the sort of most forested areas and determined that along county lines so that we weren't speaking to somebody in, South Beach. So basically, and then of course, with any research, there is a margin of error. With online surveys, we call it a credibility interval. And that's about 3.5%. So it's a pretty robust sample across all these different states. There's a few states we can pull out individually, but for the most part, we really didn't see big state by state dynamics. I'll show you a little bit of what we did see, which was more often that there might be a difference between someone living in a city or a suburb of a city versus someone in a small town or rural area. So where did they start? Where's that sort of starting point on the map for our understanding of what people are thinking? First of all, we have lots of people that when we talk about a forested area, and in the past, and I've done national work, I've done work in the West talking about forests, I've done work in individual states, like in regions like the Cumberland. We have seen that the woodlands, forested areas, is occasionally we'll get into sort of different lingo in terms of language. For the most part, we stuck to forested area, forest in terms of talking about it. And we've seen generally that in this region that still works and people understand what we're talking about. So we have a plurality that say they're very close to these areas. A few that are feeling, obviously saying that they're located somewhere far away. We haven't sort of chipped everyone these days, so we aren't following them around to know exactly what they're doing and where they are. It's probably coming in a scary way. But for the most part, we know that people identify and think of themselves as very close to these areas. And one thing that we wanted to understand is where does this sort of fall in terms of how people are feeling about these issues? And so we focused them in on different issues facing their state and asked them to tell us, is that extremely serious, very serious, somewhat serious, or really not a problem in my state? And of course, there's a range of issues given the pandemic and given all that's going on these days. Things like healthcare and the economy and unemployment, not shockingly top the list, but there are some conservation related issues that we threw into the mix that still do resonate. You can see about 2/3 said, for example, air quality was a concern in their state. And not too far behind, loss of forest land, about on par with loss of habitat for fish and wildlife, was something that a majority of respondents throughout this region indicated was an extremely or very serious problem. I'm not even showing you the proportion because almost everyone said it was at least a somewhat serious problem. So we didn't define that for them in terms of what loss of forest land means. You know, but we'll see in a second, a lot of that is really focused in on development issues. We also asked, just sort of, again, understanding a baseline here, did they think the overall condition of forests in their state had gotten better, stayed about the same, or gotten worse? A majority are telling us that they feel like it's gotten worse over time. And again, we weren't defining that for them. So, you know, in the online focus groups, we heard a lot, but mostly it was focused in on loss of forests and just seeing forests that, you know, you're driving across like when I've driven across Florida, I had focus groups right before, literally 2 days before everything shut down across the country last year. And people were saying, oh, you're going to see it when you drive across out of Orlando. There used to be trees and now they're not because they're expanding the highway. So that was a lot of what we heard. But some people talked about pests and pathogens. They talked about a range of different threats. But generally, we saw that most people were starting just at least saying at least somewhat worse or stayed about the same. There wasn't a sense that things were improving. And honestly, to some extent, that kind of helps underscore a need for taking action and a need for policies that help forests. So we're usually in a somewhat better position when we're not having to explain the problem. We also know from past work, and you'll see reference some older national surveys that we had conducted on behalf of TNC, where we asked slightly different wording, but just to try and understand who people or what entities people think that forest land is owned by. It was a government, is it private companies? And in this case, we talked about individuals and family landowners. And you can see for the most part, especially in our national work, but here, even in this region, a plurality, people are more likely to think of forests as being owned by the government. And that grows increasingly the case as we move further west. But, you know, they're not thinking about individuals and family landowners generally as the primary owners of this land. And so that's one piece of understanding that we have to sort of convey and communicate. In another quarter, we're thinking it was private companies that own those lands. We also wanted to see what people thought were the primary benefits of forests. And so we asked them to tell us how important each one of those was to them personally. Again, that was on a 4-point scale, but we're asking them to tell us whether it was extremely important, very important, somewhat important, or simply not important. When we add the somewhat importance, it's basically everything is overwhelmingly seen as at least rural areas. The benefits that that has for the public, that they connect to things like health, like keeping the air clean or filtering water to keep it clean, tend to rise to the fore. And you can just see the level of intensity there. Those are the numbers in white inside the hot pink bar there. The numbers that say it's extremely or very important are at the end there in the black. So overwhelming majority is telling us that filtering water to keep it clean or helping to keep the air clean or something. And people said, oh, I learned, you don't have to explain those to me. I learned about those in elementary school and the sort of, you know, little water cycles and the air and all of that. So occasionally we tested things in the online discussion group that people are like, yep, too basic. Even I know that stuff. So that was one of them. And then wildlife. And we do tend to see that wildlife is something that people connect with and think is important, and just that habitat. And we saw that loss of habitat for fish and wildlife was sort of on par with loss of forests right from the get-go when they thought about problems. A few other things, reducing erosion and flooding, extracting carbon from the air that contributes to climate change. We'll talk a little bit more about climate change in a second. But just places to be and go, like that provide a place to relax. And really, we were mimicking some of the language that we heard in those online discussion groups. And really, that's one proof point of relax, reduce mental strain, enjoy nature. Those were sort of the language and the ways that they described why they enjoyed visiting a forest. Now you'll note that in sort of a lower tier, still very significant, still many of these being 3/4 of respondents telling us that these are important, or at least very important, but not quite on the level that we saw some of the more health benefits or even, recreation benefits, was things like keeping rural economies strong, providing good jobs, supplying products. Those tended to be in a somewhat lower tier, still very important, but again, not with the same sort of intensity, and majority saying they're extremely important, as we saw. And then notably, it's kind of an interesting contrast, and I think we're going to see it sustained even after, hopefully, we get through this whole pandemic phase. But when we talked more about that mental benefits versus exercise benefits of recreation, we were in a more solid foundation. So that might be something to keep in mind in terms of communicating, in terms of thinking about how you might convey the value of forests to people that in terms of that aspect, which was really striking. We also, in those online discussions, talked to people about what they perceived as the threats facing forests. And in the survey, to quantify those, we had them say whether it was a major threat. Again, the numbers are in white there inside the bar, and then a minor threat. So the total that said major or minor are at the end of each bar, are not really a threat to forests in their state. And again, most of these we have the overwhelming majority saying that they're at least a minor threat. I will note that climate change tended to be a little more partisan. Everything else, really, we didn't see that dynamic, but that's fairly typical that we'll see a little bit more partisan dynamic on climate change, even though I spend the majority of my time trying to deal with that and erase that distinction. But development really tops the list. And again, people just had very evocative examples of seeing development happen and trees get cut down. And so that's just sort of, and we've seen this with wildlife as well, that loss of habitat due to development. Just saw this in a survey in Montana, for example, that was something that they see it. And so it's in their face more than a lot of these other things. And so, when we place the loss of forest land and why that might be causing, that's really the majority of people's starting point, is that. They will say, and you can see private forest land being sold or subdivided not far below that, but in terms of that being at least a minor threat. We did hear actually more than I was thinking we might about wildfires in the online discussions, and that sort of popped up, and people could give examples, but they also see that on the news as well. And even though we were talking about their state, that definitely came to the fore. And then some things like irresponsible recreation in forests, just a little bit less intensity in terms of people saying that was a major threat. And we had tested unsustainable logging in the past nationally. It tended to be higher when we looked at that nationally than what we saw here in this particular case. Oh, sorry, I beat myself to the punch here. We do have I did include the slide showing you just a little bit of difference that we saw when we talked about climate change being a threat. And it's really those saying it's a major threat where we see a more partisan distinction there. So only about 1 in 3 Republicans saying it's a major threat, moving up to a majority of those independent or unaffiliated voters, and then the overwhelming majority, 3/4 of Democrats, feeling like it's a major threat. And we see that nationally as well. So a lot of times we're trying to define, hey, what's the problem here? And I remember when I did some work in coastal Louisiana, we found that to talk about the loss of land and erosion and loss of natural areas there, that talking about it in terms of football fields was the most evocative example, and how many football fields worth of land we were losing each day was something that people really kind of captured and was easy to understand. We are losing so many football fields of forest land today. I don't know if it just lost the evocativeness in the translation. I was hoping it might translate to the broader South here. But what we saw was that actually talking about sort of the big scope and scale in our focus groups was a little bit easier to understand, that over the next 40 years, we're going to lose this massive amount of forests, whether that was 19 Grand Canyons or whether we talked about losing the equivalent of all the existing forests in Georgia. Either one of those was something that participants tended to gravitate towards a little bit more. And we've often seen that acres of land really has very little understanding beyond when we're talking to, say, farmers or ranchers or landowners. That for the public, that gets really fuzzy. We tried miles, as you can see, but that didn't quite evoke it in such a dramatic way. They said it was more concerning when they heard about it with these comparisons. So in the survey, what we did was we gave them the number. We talked about 23 million of acres being lost by 2060, primarily as a result of increased population and development if the South continues at its current rate. And then half the people we asked, the 19 Grand Canyons worth of forest land, half all the existing forests in Georgia over the next 40 years, and how concerned would they be? Okay, so what this tells us, and I think Laura lost a bet on this one, but it really didn't matter which one we used because either one was very dramatic and concerning. You can see about 2/3 said it was very concerning to hear that information in the survey, and pretty much everyone said it was at least somewhat concerning. So that they're saying that's a problem. Surveys are also a great way to test some of our hypotheses, and the group went into this, that consulted on the survey, went into this saying, look, we got this problem where people just say you shouldn't cut down any trees ever, that's really just not good to do. So we tested a statement and said cutting down trees in forest should almost always be avoided. It's interesting that when we had these conversations, just the word cut alone sounded super negative. I don't know if it's like, you don't want to cut your finger, you don't want to cut anything, but that just really evoked this very dramatic response among some of our respondents in the online discussion. In fact, we saw almost 2/3 saying, yeah, I agree with that, at least somewhat. It was only about 1 in 4 that said they strongly agree, but still, that's a really significant number. Who are those people? More likely to be younger. We do see that it only flipped though when we got to those 65 and older who were saying they disagreed with that idea. Sort of 55 plus was really sort of more divided along those lines, but especially those voters under the age of 45 and particularly those under the age of 35, really they start a conversation that cutting down a tree in a forest is almost always something that ought to be avoided. We also saw voters of color were much more likely to feel that way, and a slight gender distinction where women were somewhat more likely to say that cutting trees should almost always be avoided. And again, this is where I was saying we didn't see big variations state by state where we were able to draw those out. It was more how close are you to a forest, or do you live, in a rural area? Those were the more likely, but still, even then, a majority saying cutting down trees ought to almost always be avoided. And then there was, again, a partisan distinction here, Democrats and those who describe themselves as environmentalists, even more so than those who describe themselves as a conservationist, which is probably a whole other conversation we could have, or neither. They were far more likely to say, no, you should not be cutting down trees. So it was definitely something to keep in mind, is that that's their starting point. The other thing we saw was a starting point in the online discussion is that when we talked about individuals and family landowners and them harvesting trees on their property or on their land, there was a sense that maybe that wouldn't happen responsibly, that those landowners would just, sort of just honestly start whacking willy-nilly. There was no sort of sense among many people that this is something that, this is their land, so they might care about it, which was really striking to me. And then secondly, that there was sort of, best practices or things put in place that would really help them to know how to do this well. So in the survey, having seen that really sort of gap in perception, we wanted to test just a range of different things that we could say, given that 85% of these lands are owned by individuals and families, and understand what would give them a more favorable impression of these privately owned lands and the activities that take place on them. And what we saw really rise more to the fore than others, although none of these were really negative things, was just that they're working with foresters and state forestry associations to help them adhere to best management practices. And I don't know, I know there's very technical definitions of best management practices. I think it's more the concept and the idea for our respondents from what we saw, that just knowing that someone's going to be doing this carefully, not just out whacking, was something that really resonated. And then that it's not happening constantly, but that there's sort of these cycles. And they're not just kind of clear cutting, but most people also didn't understand there's replanting. We're going to see how a visual of that really impacted them later. So none of these are negative things to communicate, but those seem to resonate the most strongly in terms of what could help. Notably, we're also using the word managed forests in here for a reason, because that tended to be elicit a more positive impression, and that it was being done carefully. So even that word managed was thought out and tested in our discussion. Working, was interesting. We got some really negative perceptions of a working forest, where they were thinking of like sort of labor camps or something in the midst of them. Sometimes it was positive, but more often than not, managed kind of evoked a more positive response. And we did test a few quick phrases that might be used to convey the mission and the importance of Southern forests and the Keeping Forest Coalition. It was interesting that, again, the word cut didn't cut it. No pun intended there. And using the forest also seemed to evoke some negative things. And then again, not surprisingly, given that we saw the wood products and some of the jobs aspects lower, the economy and woodworks for you, those sort of quick phrases didn't quite resonate as strongly. Really, we saw sort of a play on words or softer references to harvesting being more readily accepted. And again, this was just to elicit conversation, understand how they really came to this conversation and what reaction they had to these phrases. But it was striking that it was so in line with everything we saw in the survey later as well. We tested a number of rationales why we said people should support family landowners in managing their forests well. And again, it comes back to what people thought of as the greatest benefits of having forests, period, whether they were, privately owned, government owned, whatever. They saw them as important to health. You can see that we talk about them being the sources of the nation's, much of what ends up in the nation's clean drinking water supply, wildlife, again, coming to the fore. And we definitely know that talking about specific species that are kind of, nice, that are less, that are sort of iconic, like bald eagles, or is something that people is evocative to them or their state, or is something that connects to hunting and fishing as well, given we have many hunters and anglers in here. But that was important to them. And then, as with any of the work I do in terms of talking about our natural areas and lands, that idea of a legacy for our children and grandchildren was something that came up. And we, on some of these, y'all will, I failed to say, we would test different variations. So you can see just talking about clean water, and this is kind of shocking because usually clean water is the top of the list. With forests, we saw that talking about air and water in combination was something that resonated more so. So I know this is going to seem like a lot. Not every single person saw every single one of these. We sort of had a second tier. And just a note, everything that we've seen so far has been well above the 35% very convincing. That is usually our bar for what can sort of stand on its own, that someone could use in a speech or put into an email or, explanation of what we're doing, and really stand as a very positive framing that compels people to want to support landowners in this way. Quality of life, where we talked about outdoor recreation and enjoying the peace and beauty of nature. Were I to write this again, having seen what we saw with mental health, I might evoke that a little more specifically. And then something similar to what we tested in terms of talking about family landowners and what gave them a little more positive impression of them was just talking about some of the essentially safeguards or best management practices that can be put in place to help protect water quality, avoid erosion, sustain fish and wildlife habitat when they harvest timber. Less so, just a little bit lower in terms of talking about specific numbers of jobs or talking about these areas as economic engines and in terms of the hundreds of billions of dollars in value. But still, very, very positive things to say. What was less, was a little more difficult and sort of lower tier messages was just trying to, again, talk about carbon. Either way we tested it, although carbon being locked away when wood is used in products was, I think, a more difficult concept we saw in the online discussion. And then they'd already heard the 85% number. So this is a little tricky because we gave them that information. I think that may be one of the reasons that it was a little less helpful. But again, it was really, most people look at any communications through the lens of how does this affect me, right? And so clean air, clean water, they enjoy wildlife, so they want to make sure they have a home. You know, those tend to rise to the fore simply because I think it's through the lens of how does this affect me most dramatically. And of course, with carbon, that gets into climate change, and we saw that can be a little bit more political. We asked at the end what stood out. What would they be most likely to remember 1 week from today? And we see when we're testing messages that that sticking power, something that's unique and memorable, is something that's really critically important. And you can see that just a lot of the land being owned by families and individuals and privately owned was something that really stood out for people. I'm giving you just a few quotes here, that there is a problem was something that also stood out. And then just our connection, that we need trees, we need forests, and our connection to that was something that resonated with people beyond some of the other specifics. Note where jobs in the economy is though on here. It was only 4%. So scales of degree different in terms of what people said they'd be most likely to remember 1 week from today about all the information we gave them. So again, who owns the land? There is a problem. How does this affect me in terms of my health and my connection to these places? And it's important too that our visuals really sort of reinforce some of what we saw. And so in those online discussions, we were able to present, it's one of the nice things versus me scattering pictures out on a table in an actual focus group. We were able to give them a whole bevy, and we lettered them so that we could keep track of them, bevy of different images. Note the one with the two gentlemen walking through the growing trees. Boy, they loved that. They were just like, oh, they're replanting them, they're growing them again. It was not something a lot of our respondents actually knew beforehand. Of course, wildlife, a little bit of getting out in nature and some things that they had done also resonated. These were the least compelling images that we put in front of people. And we tried for a big range. And right, this is in the pandemic when toilet paper should have been something that actually people were like, oh yeah, given the panic we saw earlier. But when we showed images, and we've seen this in other work, when we showed images of harvesting, it really turned people off. It was not even, it was dramatic. And even if it was being talked about or done in a responsible way, and not just sort of terrible images like we've seen some groups show, you know, it still was something that just, they kind of, it's sort of like when I've done work on agriculture issues and especially with beef and chicken products, you know, they don't really want to know how the sausage is made sometimes. And so we kind of saw that same thing here. And even detailed wood products and things like that, you know, were and people working on those products, again, it was just a degree of bit difference in terms of what they wanted to see. They wanted to see something a little bit more in a natural state, and the regrowing worked better than the harvesting. And then finally, we know that also what matters is not just what we say and how we say it, but who says it. And this is not to say that if you fall into one of these lower tier categories that you're not, you're not ever supposed to open your mouth. But what we have tended to see is that people relate to someone where they think they're on the front lines. So that is why you see like firefighters, wildlife biologists, state foresters, those sort of frontline folks up a little bit higher in terms of what they saw as being credible. Honestly, I could test firefighters on almost anything. It would not matter. People just love firefighters. So, um, uh, so they are, 61% said they'd have a great deal of trust for whatever they said. But we've also seen, now if I'd said federal government, quote unquote, we'd have seen a lot of skepticism and not much trust for what they had to say. But when we evoke specific entities like U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service or the U.S. Forest Service, NRCS was just a little bit less well known. And so that's why they're a tier lower, but it doesn't mean that, it doesn't mean that they're not incredibly credible. And then even State Department of Natural Resources, those were seen as overwhelmingly credible as well. But, notably, and again, it goes back to all our messaging, what I've just shown you. Look at wildlife biologists versus scientists. 46% great deal of trust versus 36%. So a 10-point difference just based on how we describe that person. And it goes back to that connection to wildlife and what they thought might be important. We didn't test every potential way of talking about a scientist here. And it's not that they're bad, because 3/4 say that they would trust them, but it's important to note that that's sort of different. And then we typically see that anyone with a sort of vested interest or financial interest is met with a little bit more skepticism. Forest products companies, therefore, I think was met with somewhat more skepticism simply because of that. And then note, individual and family landowners who manage their forest land, 72% said they'd at least have a somewhat trusting them, but it was only about 1 in 4 that said they'd have a great deal of trust for them. So they really need to be paired and put in connection with some folks that people think of as being more, quote unquote, a little bit more expert opinion to be able to convey that. The other thing this can't capture is the power of storytelling. And so I will say that when we've seen in other work, when we've tested videos of people talking about their land, working with someone on their land, that just conveys something in a very different manner. And so it's not that we can't take some of these folks and include them in something and really use that storytelling to get across some of the messages that we saw. But in no way do individual and family landowners managing their forest land they don't start out of the gate like we would see if we were talking about family farmers or ranchers in the West or something like that. It's just a little bit less familiarity. And for whatever reason, we saw immediately there was more skepticism that they would manage their lands well than we typically see if we're talking about farmers or ranchers or some other people that work their own land. Whew, that was a lot. I'm not sure, y'all, if you want me to keep the slides up so we can go back to some of them in the Q&A, or Laura, you wanted to add anything? But I know we already have questions in the Q&A, so.
Yeah, we do. Thank you so much, Lori. And again, if you put your questions in the chat and we haven't answered them as we've gone through, please go ahead and pop them in the Q&A box, which is down at the bottom, right next to raise your hand. So we'll just walk through these as they came in. Well, actually, yeah, we'll walk through them as they came in. And I'll go ahead and answer the first question, Lori, because I don't think you probably have that stat right on hand, and I happen to. So John, we have 1,902 square miles for the Grand Canyon, and we have 24,634,886 acres of forest land in Georgia. But I just want to make a quick note. I did win that bet, Lori. That was mine. So Grand Canyon and Georgia both were very, very easy for people to understand with the magnitude of that. Do you want to say anything else, Lori?
Laura, can you repeat the question? And
Yeah.
Lori, can you take your slideshow down actually so we can see everybody at once, please?
Perfect, I can.
Thank you. So the question was, do people have any idea how big the Grand Canyon is, or is it just a representation of something really big? Thank you for asking me to repeat the question, Leslie.
Yeah, it is the second. It's just a representation of something really big. Granted, I've done work on national parks as well. And it's one of the places that people have either, they've definitely seen images of it, or many people have been there personally. It's one of the most visited national parks in the country. And so there is just a sense of awe and drama and massiveness. So I don't think they know exactly the stats that Laura just conveyed, but it was sort of an idea of something huge. And so, and they didn't, that actually worked. And sometimes we see, again, as I mentioned, like with the coastal Louisiana, for example, getting it into a more tangible sort of nugget that they could chew on was really something that worked better in that case. But the drama of the massiveness of it really was more compelling for respondents when we tested it here. So I thought that was kind of striking and different from what we've seen occasionally. Oh, the question is, I often wonder if tree growers or timber growers resonates even more than family landowners when it comes to characterizing or influencing the perception of working managed forests. Oh, so the best questions are the ones we didn't end up asking. We have seen, though, that timber, again, implies, I don't know what other word to use. It implies sort of willy-nilly whacking for a lot of people. And in those images that we saw, that actually were more likely to turn people off than turn people on in terms of wanting to keep forests in private hands. Typically, family has been a really good word. And we've seen that with farmers as well, or just landowners, period. But you're right, we didn't test family tree growers. Maybe that would be a little bit helpful, because growing obviously was something they wanted to see, and they wanted to, the idea of replanting and regrowing was something that really connected in a very positive way. So we should have had you on the very first call. We could have tested that one too. So thank you for that idea. But I do like that idea of incorporating growing in here. And any idea which type of lumber in the US is most commonly harvested? That's not a question for me. I'm going to let someone else take that.
And I think, yeah, Laura can continue with reading out the questions, and then we'll just let either of you answer, or we'll look to some answers from the chat box as well.
Yeah, so I'm not sure that any of us on the call can answer any idea which type of lumber in the US is most commonly harvested, and is there any data regarding its availability? None of, Kellen, can you answer that question?
Cannot.
Okay.
But we've got some good experts in the chat. So if anybody does know that, especially from any of our state or federal agencies, that would be a good question to maybe answer over there. Good question, but again, not what we're experts in.
Well, I can tell you that the South is the wood basket of the world and produces around 16% of the world's lumber itself. Now, primarily here, you're looking at more softwoods and pine, with some hardwood. There is a hardwood market, of course, but a little bit greater in the pine market as well. Now, nationwide, I'm not sure. We got someone saying, not sure what is meant by lumber, but we can certainly do availability assessments based on FIA, which is Forest Inventory Analysis and Data. But the overall, though, the challenge is not that we have more than enough wood. We don't have enough markets. So the wood is plentiful. There's tons of wood. So there's no worry about a supply. It's only about places to sell it. And someone just put a pub in the chat box as well, and also added that softwood timber is the majority. So, and they said Doug fir in the Pacific Northwest, and of course southern pine down here in the South.
Great, thank you, Leslie. So there's just a comment here that actually I think there was also a comment further down. Wildlife biologists and firefighters are our sweet spot. Go smoking and wildlife. People love these as much as puppies. Yes, thank you. So David asks, were there any questions about forest management practices, and how about prescribed fire? Lori?
So we did, and you can speak to this, Laura, too. We did try and convey that, from the get-go, that family landowners and individuals landowners were managing their forests in a we had a conversation about how we should talk about that responsibly or sustainably, or in some way doing them, doing these things in a way that included replanting, including specific things. We did not get into a lot of detail, and I've done work for other associations where we talked more about forest management practices and decided to describe them in a way. But honestly, that was a little too far in the weeds for our respondents, in terms of they just wanted to know that it was being done in a somewhat responsible manner, to be honest. And then prescribed burns, we've done, oh gosh, I did a huge project nationwide, a focus in the interior west, where we tested tons of work on talking about prescribed burns. We actually saw controlled burns was a better way, a more favorable way to talk about that with the public, simply because it implied that people were considering the conditions, that there were experts in charge, that they were doing it in a way that was going to not get out of hand, because everybody can talk about that one forest fire that got out of hand or whatever because of that started with a controlled burn. So, but that's, you might just want to email me later or something so that we can talk offline about that, because it was a massive research project that got into how do we communicate about the appropriate uses of prescribed burns. How much do you want to
We have about 8 more minutes, so I'm going to try to get through as many of these questions as possible. And if there's any that we can answer in the chat, we'll try to do that as well to resolve them. How much time between asking and getting answers?
Well, it's very fast. So I think I had at the beginning, it was like September 20 something through October 2nd. It was when we were conducting the survey, and the online focus group is live. It's over a 3-day period. So that was done in August 1st. So we could see what gaps in perception, what things we wanted to talk more about, and how to, sort of cull down the amount that we were going to be testing in the survey. And then, it wasn't a mail survey, it was done online, so it was immediate in terms of responses.
Great. Any thoughts on the application of this information relative to other regions of the United States? And you, Lori, have done similar research in other areas.
Yeah, so nationally, we've seen, I mentioned before, just the perception that government owns the land is more likely to be higher when we talk to people nationally, especially in the West. But I think in terms of the communicating and the scope and the scale of the problem, in terms of communicating the benefits, I mean, that is very much in line with what we've seen nationally. There are obviously a few very localized exceptions. I've done a lot of work in Maine, for example, where people are much more likely to connect with the value of the economic impact and the jobs that are there in the industry. So, there can be exceptions, but I'd say for the most part, in talking to most people, most places in our country, that a lot of what we've seen in these dynamics holds true.
Great.
So I would add to that, and this maybe touches a little bit on some thoughts and questions further down, and maybe even one that I mentioned answered earlier. That, as I mentioned in the beginning, we just had a huge gap of information in the South about how people thought about forests, both in their yard, as part of their community, as part of economic development, et cetera. Now that we have this information, it's vitally useful for those people making decision makers, making decisions about how land is used, how it is protected, how it is funded, quite honestly. And so from my perspective, running campaigns, this is what I do. There's a lot of education that needs to be done and outreach, because again, we can have national numbers and kind of a sense of the bigger scale of how people are thinking about forests, but to be able to take specific data to a decision maker, whether that be a state economic developer, maybe that is someone who is in a corporate level working somewhere on the wood supply chain related to the South, and then certainly our elected officials, it's much more potent. So I think that there's a lot of use and a lot of directions that we can take this initial product of research, and not only dig in, but then test some of these messages and see, like, is this really going to resonate towards maybe better policy or better incentives or ways to support those family landowners or the various professional forest managers that are out there. So yeah, I think it's just a good start. And again, I think that as we dig into this a little bit more, Keeping Forests and many of the members of the coalition of Keeping Forests, there'll be much more data to come.
Yeah. And following up on that, Adam asked a question, was the data incorporated in the state forest action plans? I know that you guys are in the middle of revising those, or at least I believe you are. And so this is the first time that we've presented this to a wider audience. So my guess is that no, but again, the data is on the Keeping Forest website, keepingforest.org/resources. Also, I just want to point out what the southern area is. It's 13 states in the South, from Virginia to Oklahoma down to Texas and then over. I also put a link in the chat box if you want to see that geographic map. So there's a question that I really want to pull forward, Lori, because I think, it's down the list. When we're presenting slideshows to the public, should we focus solely on planting and not just not mention timber cutting, or should we try to educate the public as to the benefits of timber cutting?
Well, I think it needs to be sort of like the Lion King cycle of life idea, right? So it's not like we ever want to say harvesting without also at the same time incorporating the replanting and I'm probably not using all the right technical words, but that we're always sort of incorporating that, and it's this whole cycle that takes place, because otherwise they just think the harvesting and they never sort of get back to the replanting. I would say in terms of visuals, it was dramatic how much that was a negative, especially with big machinery and out on the sort of out on the land, that just, that really was a turnoff. So I would think that the replanting in terms of images would be what I prefer to see. But it's not that you can't talk about it. It's just that it needs to be sort of wrapped into this cycle.
Great.
And harvesting being the beginning of the cycle, not the end. That's fine, but it doesn't matter. It just needs to be that circle so that they're always seeing that it's coming back.
So Lori, any sense of how engaged people are with land management agencies? As in, are they following our social media, reading news articles about us, commenting on our projects through NEPA? Did you get any sense of that from the who do they trust questions?
No, we really didn't ask that specifically. I think it's more a sense of authority in terms of those agencies and entities rather than really following it actively. There was just way too much misperception for them to be that well informed, to be up on your social media, I would think.
Where's the question? I'm sorry, I'm trying to scroll through ones that might be, because we just have one more minute. So this is going to be the last question, and I saw it somewhere that I wanted to. I wonder how responsive would vary from rural small town versus large town metro people. Is that something you ever try to quantify or classify? We'll end with that question.
Yeah, we have that broken out. I responded to one person mentioning that. We have every question broken out by that city, suburb versus smaller towns versus rural areas, so that we could look at that specifically. And there did tend to be some distinctions, but I will say, even when we were thinking about like the benefits that forests might provide to your state and your community, like still, even in the rural areas, the wildlife aspects, the air and water aspects, those were still over jobs and wood products and all of that. So in the discussion group, I mean, we definitely had people that had interacted with private landowners. We purposely excluded people who were foresting their own land, because that would, they would have been experts that people deferred to. But we generally saw in rural areas more intimate knowledge of that. but it didn't mean that they didn't prioritize some of the same things, and the same messages and all that still resonated more. I would say someone mentioned that maybe you could talk about new forest development in Scotland, and mentioned that in Scotland. And I like that concept of new forest, but given what we saw with development being sort of the boogeyman for the threat to forests, we might think about a different way of a different word there. That would, you know, I love the word growing. That seemed to be where people were in terms of thinking about this. So.
Fantastic. Well, thank you, Lori, so much for adding a wealth of knowledge to the Keeping Forests initiative, giving us within the coalition some really good ground to start from, as well as the community at large. I hope that you guys have found, you participants have found this useful, interesting. Please let us know how you do take this research forward. We would be really interested to see where you're applying it and how you're applying it. I'm going to drop my email into the chat box, that if you have any questions, I can either forward them to Lori or to Kellen, or if I can answer them, I'll do that directly or hand you to the right person. And yeah, we also have a newsletter, so please sign up for that as well. And you will, as further information develops and we take this forward, we will also let you know how we're using it. So thank you so much. Drop in my email in the chat box, and we'll see you soon.
And for anyone who's ending up, you can view this archived webinar at the same link. It'll be there in a couple days, and please complete the evaluation at the end of the process. So thanks so much for joining us.
Thank you.
Bye, thank you.
And for Lori and Laura, I can get you guys the Q&A